got much more into thinking about the political philosophy of AI, because I realized that AI based on machine learning was the most significant means of extending the capabilities of those who have power that has been invented since, I guess, since the invention of, so like a really significant force multiplier for those who govern. And as we were talking about before, we see that with the AI companion and summaries in Zooms, like the ability to take all of the recording that we're doing and translate that into actionable insights that you can then use to shape people's behavior. It's bananas.
Hey there, I'm your host Josh, and this is Generally Intelligent, a podcast by Imbue. We are an independent research company. We are working on developing AI agents that mirror the fundamentals of human-like intelligence and that can learn to safely solve problems in the real world. On this podcast, we interview researchers about their behind-the-scenes ideas, opinions, and intuitions that are hard to share in papers and talks. We hope that you learn as much as we have in our quest to understand and build the mind. Our guest today is Seth Lazar, a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University. I'm also joined by Matt Boulis, our head of policy.
Josh, it's great to be here today. Very excited to have Seth on with us. He's a distinguished moral and political philosopher in his own right, and he's breaking significant ground in helping us evolve our understanding of concepts like equality, fairness, and legitimacy in an era where technology is changing everything.
Thanks a bunch, Seth. It's great to have you on the podcast, and we're really excited to dig in and learn a little more about your work. Maybe one quick thing for our listeners before we start. This episode is going to be a little bit different than our normal one in that Seth's background is not strictly in machine learning research. So this is not really a machine learning research episode so much as a research about the effects of AI and machine learning downstream, like how do these things affect society and the rest of the world, which I think is something that's good for us to think about as people making these technologies. So how did you get into this? Like, how did you get started? Where did your initial interest in this come from?
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher, and my PhD was on the ethics of war. And I got into thinking about moral and political philosophy largely because it felt like the only form of intellectual inquiry where you could really like directly address these normative questions about what we ought to do. Like every other area of academia that I'd looked at was very hesitant to actually make these really firm value judgments, like really tries to avoid it. And yet at the same time, in everything like what we do in everyday life, we're making them all the time. And I didn't feel like I really understood them well enough. So when I started working on this stuff, it was in like, on war, it was around 2006, like Iraq, Afghanistan, terrorism, all these sorts of things happening, lots of people making strong moral arguments, left, right, and center. But within the research space, everyone trying to avoid that, or if not avoiding it, then just really assuming that everyone agrees with you about what you think. So a lot of the more critical social sciences, a lot of that research area is really based around us like an assumption of a certain type of, broadly speaking, lefty politics that you don't really have to defend. You just assume everyone else shares. So I got into philosophy because I wanted to do that normative thinking. And then like AI has always been an interest as a consumer of sci-fi and as like someone who's interested in technology just generally. In the 2010s, it was always just something I thought was cool and futuristic. And then I had this road to Damascus moment where I figured out like it was actually here, if you know what I mean. Where like I am a big photographer, like you can see in the background. I've got my night sky pictures up there. And in the early days of social media, I'd just moved to Australia, like I was a big oversharer. And I liked getting all this positive feedback on my pictures. And I used Adobe Lightroom to edit my photos. And there was an update that went out in like late 2017, I think December 2017, where they updated the auto photo processing in Lightroom. Now, up until this point, the way they process photos, if you pressed auto, it would basically equalize the distribution of light across the histogram, which is like fine if you're taking a picture of a studio test card in studio lighting, but in any other context, just is completely useless. So you would never ever use it, not even as a starting point. And then they rolled out this update, and it was like, it knows what sky and how to process the sky, and it knows what's a face and how to process the face, and it can differentiate between these things. And it knows where you're going for drama and where you're going for something less. And suddenly you could do autophoto processing, and it would actually get you like 90% of the way towards the actual finished version that you would be going for. And like I was blown away by this. And obviously it was because they started using neural networks and machine learning and the analysis of the pictures in order to process them appropriately. So on the one hand, I was blown away by that. I thought it was amazing. And then immediately my next thought was like, shit, I've got about 10,000 photos on Facebook, which I had just assumed that it would take a person to actually look at in order for it to be sort of to compromise my privacy, because I'd assumed that computers were too thick to do it in any kind of meaningful way. So then, like, seeing how immediately these images were legible to computers, making them sort of so much more surveillable. In the same stroke, it was seeing the exciting potential of AI, in this case for computational photography and for photo processing, and also for surveillance. And so, like within a few weeks of soul searching, I deleted all of my pictures from Facebook, and I'd started looking for AI researchers in my university to find and work on some of this stuff. And so that was where it all began with thinking about it, right? Sort of late 2017, realizing that actually there had been some really significant changes. And you could talk about this stuff in a way that wasn't, I love reading sci-fi, but I don't necessarily want to do philosophy of science fiction because there's no rules. Like you could say anything. And like as a philosopher, that's already a big risk. So I wanted something where there was like there was a technology that had reached a certain level of capability in order for me to be able to work on it seriously.
And so what were some of those first explorations that you did, those first topics that you got into or research questions that you were asking?
This is kind of interesting because there was a pathway in that felt very promising, turned out to be a bit of a dead end, but may now be reopening again. So in between doing work on the ethics of war and on AI, I'd worked a lot on the ethics of risk. So moral decision making under risk and uncertainty. This obviously came out of the war work because you can't go very far thinking about the ethics of war without starting to think about the fog of war and the fact that you never know what you're really trying to do and who you're targeting, all those sorts of things. And that led me into doing work on decision theory. And that was a bridge into thinking about AI because so much of AI rests on decision theoretic foundations. So it meant that when I started talking with computer scientists, we had like a franker that we could exchange ideas in. And my work in the ethics of risk had really been focused on figuring out how to take a sort of rights and duty based approach to ethics and make it compatible and consistent with decision theory, which is sort of superficially is better associated with an approach where what you really care about is the outcomes of your actions and probability distributions over those outcomes rather than necessarily the character of the actions themselves. So my big shtick was on what we call deontological decision theory. So that's the rights and duty based part. And so my starting point to think about AI was like, okay, well, what we're going to do, obviously, is you've got these machines that you need to act ethically in some sense. You're going to have to find a way of taking your ethical guidance, your principles, your values, and incorporating them in a mathematical language such that the machine can act on those kinds of principles, right? So the work that I've been doing on deontological decision theory is likely to be a sort of a bridge into thinking about how to encode moral values into machines. Now, what that worked out to be was a classic, like top-down, good old-fashioned AI type approach to moral reasoning, which, in the same way as when you do that for everything else, has its obvious limitations. And they became apparent fairly fast. And like when I started seeing people like trying to express Kant's categorical imperative in formal logic so that it could in principle be computed, it was just like, I think we've taken a bit of a wrong turn here somewhere. So that was like, one of the other things I guess we'll talk about is like, where have you had failures? That was the way in. It provided a useful lever. But as a research path at the time, it really did peter out. And I went into doing other things. I got much more into thinking about the political philosophy of AI because I realized that AI based on machine learning was the most significant means of extending the capabilities of those who have power that has been invented since the invention of, so like a really significant force multiplier for those who govern. And as we were talking about before, we see that with the AI companion and summaries in Zooms, like the ability to take all of the recording that we're doing and translate that into actionable insights that you can then use to shape people's behavior. It's bananas. So I end up focusing on that. But the cool thing is that with the natural language capabilities of LLMs, there's a sense in which you can go back to some of those more top-down-y type approaches to ethics for AI that were closed off when you had to find a way of mathematizing complex moral concepts. Now you can actually leverage natural language understanding and sort of an underlying moral understanding of those concepts. You can do some cool things that have actually got me returning a little bit to some of those early research attempts, which is quite exciting.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the things that we did a little bit of research on last year was on the ethics data set, which I think is trying to get at some of these questions. It's having played with it a little bit and, trying to make systems that answer those questions. and looked at all the answers that people give and made people generate new answers to these questions and look at the rationales for them, I have a lot more respect for the difficulty and complexity and interestingness of these. It's not just a simple yes, no, right or wrong. And it's not just like a, gold standard. Oh, yep, here you go. It's a simple data set. In the same way that like classifying something as a cat or a dog, like a lot of the time, these things that we have in computer science are so simplified and removed from the real world that like, yes, it's very objective, just X, Y, Z, very, very easy to do. These questions are not at all like that. So they're interesting and very challenging for that reason. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that is so attractive about this as an area to work on as a philosopher is that, like, a lot of the things you work on in moral and political philosophy, what you're essentially trying to do is vindicate conclusions that we all, or well, many of us already feel. So one way that John Rawls, who's the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century, one way that he described his work was as a project of like reconciliation to make us feel that the institutions that we inhabit are ones that we can be reconciled to, that they're ones that we can actually justify.
mhm.
So you've got a sort of a practice that we already have, and you're trying to figure out how to make sense of it. And like that's a valuable and useful thing to do. And I've done some of that. My work on the ethics of war was about trying to vindicate the principle of non-combatant immunity, something that is very widely endorsed, but at the same time, it's quite hard to provide really good arguments for it.
Mhm.
But something that's even more exciting is when you have an area where you really don't know what we should be doing. And like, it's not the case that you've just got, all right, well, this is what we need to do. We've got to vindicate that. Or we know what we need to do in this other area. We want to apply it to this area, just going to transfer across from one to the other. It's genuinely that we just don't really know. And that normative uncertainty and openness is extremely exciting as a moral political philosopher because you're trying to answer questions that there aren't already answers to. You're not just trying to vindicate common sense. You're trying to figure out what a common sense response should be. So that's what I really like about this. I mean, and the ethics data set you bring up, like that, I think is a really interesting one. And I love that paper that you mentioned, the way you focus on the sort of the reasons for the errors that the language models are making. It'd be great to come back to some of that stuff a bit later. But even that data set, like what they're trying to do is they intentionally exclude the sort of hard cases in order to just get ones where there's broadly unanimous agreement among the data annotators. So it's like it's an important stepping stone. It's really useful and produces interesting insights. But to get at real moral understanding, I think goes significantly beyond that. And we can talk about this later, but I've got an approach that we're trying to figure out, we're trying to deploy and get funding for, as you know, with the GAS project
Mhm.
around understanding ethical sensitivity of language models, which I think goes like significantly beyond their ability to predict data annotators' verdicts in easy cases.
Mhm.
I think that there's a real facility with moral concepts in there that can be operationalized in interesting ways. But, as you say, there's really interesting questions about its robustness and the ways in which and the reasons why it fails.
Yeah, I think that's true. And actually, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on the podcast is that there is a lot of interesting complexity here. And I think as more of a computer scientist or a scientist, it's a little bit scary for me. It's exciting for you as a political philosopher. It's a little bit scary for me when it's like, well, wait, we don't actually even know what the right answers here are. Like, I can't, there's no spec.
Oh, yeah, hell yeah. And when we started working on this, when I started working on this with computer scientists, they were very much like, okay, so we've got these problems. We want you to tell us what the answers are. You tell us what the moral goal is here, and then we can incorporate that into the system. And it was just like, guys, that's not how any of this works. That's not how any of this works. We've been asking the same questions for thousands of years for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe one of the other reasons, selfishly, that I was excited to have you on the podcast is I would like other people. I think our audience is almost entirely machine learning researchers, computer scientists, programmers. I would like other people in our field to have a better understanding of what are these issues, what are those complexities, why haven't we been asking those same questions for a long time? Like, why haven't we answered those questions? We've not been asking the same questions about how to sort lists for a long time, right? We figured it out. We know the best way to sort a list. Okay, great. Like, what prevents us from getting to answers? And there are very good answers to that question, I'm sure. But I think it'd be much better for a lot of us to have a little more exposure to those issues and the complexities and nuances that come from this stuff engaging with the real world.
Yeah, I think there's a trap and a risk that happens when things can seem really good. For instance, and we'll probably get into this, but if you have a machine reliably producing an output or an outcome at the cost of participation or resistibility or notions like that, I think if you don't have the vocabulary or the concepts, being possessed only of the intuition is not powerful enough a basis to resist what otherwise feels like a good thing. And I've noticed this in a lot of policy conversations where you say, well, we could use machines to get rid of this category of bad. And to be able to fight back and say, well, no, it comes at too much of a cost of these other foundational values, that's hard work. And I think the thing that I'm quite appreciative and excited to delve into with you is just that actually people you're driving someone to this are actually now doing that work, and that's giving us more concepts, and particularly in the public discourse, to bring to the table that really haven't been there. And a lot of the public discourse has felt simplistic to me. So it's not just engineers; it's so many people haven't had sort of the
Yeah.
tools. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think there's two factors that make this especially urgent and important. So one is obviously many of the decisions that are being made now are going to fundamentally shape significant aspects of our future. So the folks who are listening to your podcast are designing tools and systems that are going to have an extraordinary societal impact.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing so on the basis of their sense of what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. What has been heartening has been lots of people do care about the impact that these things have. I don't think we're dealing on the whole with a sort of, like there have been earlier generations that have basically, whether it might be engineers or whoever, who have had a much more, we'll leave the policy stuff to other people kind of attitude. Like, we're just creating tools. You guys decide how to use them. The tools neither good or bad, blah, 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 that sort of thing. So I think it's good that there's much more general normative commitment, with a few exceptions, among people who are designing the future. But because of that desire for certainty, I think a lot of folks have focused around a particular normative framing that offers that uncertainty at the expense of nuance. So there, I mean, in particular, people who have been worried about the existential risk from future AI systems. And like, one of the reasons why people are worried about that, or why they focus on that, is because it removes all of these difficult questions about uncertainty. Because we all know it would be bad for the whole human race to be wiped out. There's no debate. I mean, some people might debate it, but only on the margins in sort of obscure philosophy papers. For almost everybody else, wiping out humanity sucks. And you don't need to have these complicated questions about, like, what do we really want to do? And I agree, and wiping out humanity does suck, and it's good that people are paying attention to that. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the false dichotomies that have come up in this space. But also, it's very much not enough. Like, there's a very low bar to set yourself normatively. Let's just make sure we don't wipe out humanity. Like, there's a lot more that we want to do beyond that. And you can't avoid getting into these tricky, thorny questions and all of the uncertainty and disagreement and dispute that goes with that. I think that's one of the reasons, gnostically, why people have focused so much on that very extreme scenario, is because it responds to that desire for certainty that you're talking about, Josh.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting point, actually, that I hadn't really considered. That's why, but that makes a ton of sense now that you say it and now that I think about it. I'm a little bit sympathetic to that as well, like you. Yes, everyone dying would definitely suck. That seems really bad. And then, how do you weigh that against something that seems like, oh yeah, there's like this short-term harm that's like a little bit bad for a few people, like, but there's this other really big one. And how do you balance those two things is a really interesting question, both in like a practical and even theoretical sense. So I'm sympathetic to those views, but I can see why for engineers they would be particularly attracted to like, removing all this messy uncertainty. And I think you probably have to get into that messy uncertainty in order to really solve this problem in a like useful, good way. As you said, it's like far too low of a bar.
Yeah, for sure. And like, if you really took it seriously as the sort of the magnitude of value that's at stake, then pretty much almost certainly have to go down the Eliezer Yudkowsky route and start bombing data centers now. Like, if you don't have a more nuanced view, if you don't incorporate other factors into your deliberations besides just the one big bad thing, then it makes it almost impossible to have a reasonable approach to how you spend your time now. Some people you do see have gone down that black hole and do find it extremely hard to make any decisions about the present in virtue of that sort of like terror looming over them. But I think most people do pragmatically just incorporate other things into their value equation. And it's just a matter of like digging into those and figuring out which of those are well supported and which of them aren't.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, although I want to push back on that slightly. And that I think it's not really a good strategy to start bombing data centers or whatever right now. No one's going to listen to you. That's not actually going to stop anything. It won't actually change anything. Even if the thing is, like, even if you are most concerned about existential risk, actually what you end up instrumentally wanting to do in the near term is pretty aligned with other people who want to fix near-term harms. Like, really, if we want to get good at fixing this like really big, bad future speculative harm, maybe we should build up some practice on like the harms that are happening today, kind of make things incrementally better and work on things where we can measure them and see them and like make things incrementally safer and incrementally more understandable. Like, a lot of this stuff, I think, actually ends up being relatively aligned.
So yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, I think the point is more that like having such an enormous, if you take it seriously and if you have it as the only value that's at stake, then it can lead to a paralysis.
Mhm.
It's a little bit like Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit like that. So there's a nice paper by a colleague of mine called Waging War on Pascal's Wager. And basically the premise of the paper is that Pascal gets things wrong because he assumes that like your only choice is between the sort of believing in God and this sort of this expectation of an infinity of damnation. Actually, if you have infinite values that are in play, then everything that you do potentially could lead to an infinite bad. And if you also have like infinite goods on the other side, then you actually end up with an expectation that is undefined because you've got infinite goods and infinite bads on the other side. So you end up in a paralysis.
Mhm.
So that's really what I mean is that like if you only have this one big bad in your normative horizon, then it induces it like if you take that seriously, it would induce a certain paralysis.
Mhm.
Pragmatically, I think we do inevitably have to make decisions about what to do now. I think on the whole, I agree that most of the things that we want to do to reduce the more extreme risks from AI are consistent with things that we want to do to reduce the risks that are more present.
Mhm.
I do think that there are some divisions, for example, when it comes to thinking about open source, where I think that a sort of push for decentralization, which is really important for mitigating some of the very likely risks of AI systems around concentration of power, has been pushed back against by some of the folks who are more concerned about the higher magnitude, lower probability risks on grounds of disseminating these models, potentially leading to more bad actors having access to them.
Mhm.
So I do think that you get some of those forks in the road. I also think that like the appetite for regulating foundation models due to motivations coming out of concerned about existential risk, to my mind, has led to some bad decisions in the last year where there's been a sort of an apparent alignment between folks who are concerned with the present and folks who are concerned with the further future. But where I think that's led to just rushing through regulations for systems that we don't really understand well enough to regulate successfully.
Mhm.
For the most part, with the EU AI Act or with the executive order, it's stuff that is intentionally designed to be fairly malleable. So regulations that will be susceptible to change over the next year or two. But I do on the whole think that there's been a bit of a mad dash to regulate for the sake of regulating, which I think is probably going to have adverse near-term consequences, whether through becoming irrelevant or through limiting the decentralization of power.
Mm. Do you have any specific examples that come to mind for that?
Yeah, so I'm particularly thinking about the way in which the EU, like there's become this sort of real focus on flops as a metric of regulation. And I think that like what it ends up meaning is that you sort of like it gets semiotically divorced from its foundation. So the EU wants to present as being a tougher regulator than the US. So if the Biden executive order says 10 to the 26 flops is where the concerns come in, the EU is going to say 10 to the 25. And it's like, I mean, this is a super arbitrary thing to be doing one-upmanship on. It's immediately going to lead to all sorts of approaches that we're already seeing to kind of forms of distributed training of foundation models that will be way hard to focus on. And like really importantly, it's just not the thing that matters. Like there was a really nice proposal out from Stanford's Center for Research on Foundation Models around how to actually distinguish between high impact and low impact foundation models on the basis of their actual impacts rather than on the basis of some upstream thing about the training process. And that would have been, I think, much better to do, but also like it was brought together with impressive speed by the team there. But like the really good regulation on AI that we're seeing is based on 5 or more years of research and experience of seeing these systems out in the wild, seeing how they're used. And like, while it's true that you don't want to let too many bad things happen before you start regulating, you don't want every kind of regulation to be a tombstone. But at the same time, you also don't want to rush in when you don't really know what you're doing. And I
Mhm.
think that the EU discredited itself a bit last year by its sort of mad dash one way or the other. You know, at the start of the year, oh, we've got to change everything to incorporate these changes with GPT 3.5 and GPT 4. Now we're pushing back against this because we've got Mistral and Aleph Alpha and we want to preserve the strength of our national champions.
Mhm.
Now we're going back the other way. It's all just a little bit like it undermines the regulatory process to be messing around in that way.
Mhm.
Whereas I think when you're talking about things like surveillance, labor rights, those sorts of questions, like that, we have a lot more research on that, like auditing. So that stuff we can do. And I think it's a bit regrettable that those things where we have really good regulations ready to go have got smushed together with the foundation model stuff where people are basically pulling stuff out of their bum, not to be too crude about it. And the obvious consequence of that as well is that they're relying far too heavily on white papers and policy documents from the leading AI labs, which are like some really interesting stuff. But like this whole, regulation on the basis of flops, that's all basically come out of some papers by OpenAI. The Andy Leung one on regulating frontier models. It's cool. It's a really good initial exploration of what should be done here. But we know very well from history that you don't want to let companies write the regulations that constrain their own practices. It's just marking your own homework. It's not a good practice, just as a matter of regulatory theory. So taking a beat, being a little bit less hysterical, recognizing that we've got time to do this properly, I think would have been really good. I do think the executive order on AI was much better in that respect because it took in whatever it was, 280 days for consultation on a lot of these questions. Obviously, the fact that it's only an executive order sucks because if you guys do what it looks like you're going to do in November, then that will be out of the window. But such is life.
I wanted to kind of float something that's fascinated me is why it seems so many policy leaders, at least last year, talked about this need to have like comprehensive AI regulation. And that's somewhat bizarre because you were tethered to the tech in a way that when you talked about all the other things that we can be working on labor rights and on, you're actually tethered to the impact and the people who you need to protect. And what is it about? I mean, what challenge on what is it about this desire to have these comprehensive frameworks rather than this more tactical orientation to go after the individual issues? Because because often the issues are so different from one another. They implicate completely different realms of thought and evaluation.
I think that sort of comes down a little bit to the sociology of regulation and the desire to be seen as the first. This even happened with, I wrote a thing for The Guardian the other day, a little while ago. The headline, like obviously you never have control over the headline when you're writing op-eds. It's one of the most annoying things. And then people only read the headline and then they only respond to the headline. You're like, saying that stuff. And like the headline was, the US is racing ahead on AI regulation. Why is the EU so far behind? It's like, wasn't what I said. What I said was, it's good that the US is basing their regulations on research rather than just shooting off without thinking a bunch of regulations on stuff they don't understand well enough. But that race aspect of it, being the world leader in AI regulation, it's like a respectable silver medal. You want to be the world leader in AI innovation. Like that's the goal. That's the thing that everyone really wants. But if you can't do that because you're the EU, then you want to be the world leader in AI regulation and be the scold. So I think that a lot of those silly dynamics play a big role in the aspiration for like a comprehensive approach. I think also there's a hindsight bias element as well that like now when you look at social media and online platforms, it's clear that they're a big thing and that we failed to regulate them adequately in advance. And there is need for sort of a certain kind of comprehensive regulation of online platforms. And so there's a sense that we're replaying that and we want to get ahead of the game and treat AI in the same way. And like, I don't think that's entirely wrong. I do think that like foundation models are going to be a sort of platform and they're going to create a new platform economy. And I think that they are going to merit a regulation as foundation models. I think that that's going to be different from the sectoral regulation of the use of all sorts of different AI systems within policing, within labor, within journalism, within wherever it might be. And so I think that like there's a narrative, a bias in favor of a certain kind of narrative that has led to this desire for comprehensive regulation, inspired by the impacts of social media and digital platforms. So yeah, it's a funny one though. Like if you ask most people, I would say, and like you might have been working on this for a long time, will say that the need is to tighten up regulation in particular areas, make sure that existing regulations are being applied and that we don't just sort of treat AI as this complete game changer. And we've seen a number of statements by people saying, look, we're not ready for this. We don't know what the regulation should be. Like in many different sectors, what we really need to do, as you well know, is apply existing regulations properly to AI rather than treat it as something that's completely sui generis. It's just, I think, very hard for people to hold all of these things in their heads at the same time, especially within a media environment that encourages them to say the more dramatic thing. So even when I said at the beginning, there are loads of things that we don't know about AI, like loads of normative questions that are unanswered. Like there are, but there's also a lot that we do know the answer to. Like your boss shouldn't be able to scan all of your work meetings to see who's complaining about stuff. As we shift to having more online meetings and we move away from having that ability to say something off the record, saying something off the record is a really valuable thing not having your boss know everything that you're saying in your meetings and be able to pull out all of your like that part of it. That's not like we need to do fancy new moral and political philosophy. That's like we know that's bad, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen. And existing labor law is not like in some cases it's sufficiently strong to protect that. In some countries it isn't, and we need to work in order to make that stronger. So
Mhm.
I think that like that's the difficult thing is that like we're all attracted to the new for obvious reasons, but then that becomes the overarching thing that people want to make a linchpin for a comprehensive approach where actually you need to be more tactical and focus more on the different sectoral areas.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I liked about the EO actually was that there was so much like getting into the weeds on a whole bunch of different things. It's like, oh, okay, like that seems like better than just like a high level like blanket. Oh, we're just going to regulate AI in this broad way, based on the basis of flops or something like that. Yes, that was actually part of it. I think there was some flops cut offs in there, but
I read a really cynical blog post about
Mhm.
the EO, which was like, oh, this looks like a bunch of bureaucrats are just going to write a lot of memos. And the thing was, they absolutely are. But those memos are going to be the things that have sorted out the way that we're going to now take these existing regulations, existing statutory authority. It had struck me that that spoke to this gap often between fields in terms of understanding how does policy actually play out, how does regulation get impacted, and regulation is boring, but it's important boring, and for the right sort of person, like super fun boring. And I want to jump on this bit about your boss being able to go through all the recordings because it's curious things. There's really curious sequence happening, right? Your boss always could, right? Like you could have mandated that all Zoom calls are recorded, right? And if you're a salesperson and you use sales enablement software, all your sales calls are actually recorded. They're transcribed. AI is sorting out which sales reps talk too much and blow the deals and which don't. And there's this is the standard on that. But there's this really interesting thing that happens where you don't have the justification to surveil 5 years ago. Now, if we say, oh, well, all the Zoom calls are recorded because we need to use this funky AI assistant, now we then have this. It's this very curious way of purchasing the right to do these things, and they're ostensibly justified by business objectives. And so I feel like there's actually there is like a moral philosophical question that starts to emerge where you do have these interests and they're real. Like as a boss, to how much time do companies waste on meetings? And can we make our meetings more effective? And so we can, whether or not that's ever going to actually happen is a separate point. But it's where we find ourselves when the technology starts to shift the justifications for.
I think, well, I mean, that's a perfect transition into actually one of Seth's articles that I really liked, which was What's Wrong with Automated Influence, which I think is getting at some of the ideas here of like,
absolutely.
It's, yeah, I'll let you explain, Seth, basically the core idea behind that.
This paper, like, there's really two sides to what you're just talking about there, Matt. And I think it's really interesting to look at them in tandem. So, what we find with AI, obviously, is that you're able to kind of operationalize all of these recordings. So, for however long, the UK, for example, has been one of the world's most surveilled societies with CCTV cameras. Loads and loads and loads of CCTV cameras everywhere. And this goes back, certainly at least to the early noughties, when the only way you could really operationalize all of that recording was by having people actually review it, right? So you've got all of this data, but you can only actually use it to a certain degree because it's just you don't have a method of analyzing it. And so this is an instance where AI is a force multiplier for those with power, already recording all of this data, but now you can actually draw insights out of it in ways that, like you say, could sometimes have a very valid business justification, could sometimes be about trying to figure out who in the company is complaining. Especially, I mean, for me, I guess I was starting out from thinking about this within the context of universities, where we have this underlying principle of academic freedom, which gives us sort of greater protections against those sorts of incursions by managers. But like that's one aspect of AI there is the ability to draw out insights from all of this surveillance, all of this capture and recording of all of our behavior. The flip side of that, obviously, is that surveillance enables you to also influence, to shape behavior, to shape the behavior that you're monitoring. Sometimes this can happen through a manager calling someone in for a meeting and saying, hey, I found out that you've been doing this, that, and the other, and like you're fired or whatever. But also it can happen through the subtle nudges that we get through our online behavior and through interacting with digital platforms. And so the motivation for the paper on automated influence really started out of thinking about that whole nexus of issues. It really began with reading the Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and thinking like, wow, this picture of our lives is really bleak. It feels like if all of this were true, we would just be these marionettes on strings being manipulated by digital advertisers and whoever. But it doesn't feel like that's what's going on, because like I can't remember the last time I bought something from clicking on a digital ad, even though they follow me around the whole internet and they're really annoying. And like Belroy, looking at you, Christ, Belroy have decided I am like the ideal Belroy customer. And I just get Belroy. And like, you know what? I actually am. And I like their stuff, but I'm not going to fucking buy any of it because they keep advertising it to me and it's annoying. But that's like the level of how annoying the automated, like I'm not a marionette, I'm not a puppet, certainly I feel like one. So what the paper started out from was like, okay, well, what actually is wrong with automated influence? Because it still does feel, it seems creepy and unpleasant, but it doesn't seem to be as effective as it's imagined to be by this hypercritical view that you get out of Zuboff. So, how do we then understand it? How do we normatively evaluate it? For those of your audience who aren't into political philosophy, this is like one example of a type of philosophy paper where it's like you've got a phenomenon that people widely agree is problematic, but none of the arguments for why seem to be super plausible. And you just get this really overstated stuff, like they're using your data. They're stealing from you. Your data is being used. It's like, well, is it your data? I mean, you're generating it through using websites that aren't yours. And like they've produced some of the infrastructure, someone else has produced the rest of the infrastructure. If this was any other kind of artifact, you wouldn't just say it was like, it was yours, it's only yours. So like we have these really hyperbolic arguments being made in the public sphere that don't seem to hold water. But at the same time, it does seem like something problematic is going on. It's not like we want to just say, oh, well, everything's fine. Like, the public debate is completely mistaken. We share some of those intuitions. We just don't have a good sense of what grounds them. So that was what the paper tried to do. And then what we essentially argued was that, like, for a series of objections grounded in privacy and exploitation, manipulation, if you just look at it as like in this very individualistic way, where it's like your privacy is being invaded, you are being manipulated, you are being exploited, the objections against automated influence seem fairly weak. But if you think about it in a more collective way, looking at the impacts on populations as a whole, then they start to look more plausible. Like individually, maybe, your individual privacy isn't being that much undermined, but what they are doing is creating an incentive for everyone to gather more information about you in whatever context they can. And like you as a population are now being surveilled to a significantly greater degree than before. That seems problematic. You individually aren't being exploited. It's not like you have an absolute right to like your data that you create. But we collectively are, because there's a huge amount of value that's being drawn out of us from our behavior online that is just being sequestered and enclosed. We saw this with the time we were writing about online recommender systems and real-time bidding for advertising. I mean, we've seen it all the more so with language models and generative AI, where the whole process is about extracting value from the body of knowledge or of art that has been created by others, enclosing that, centralizing it, and then using it to make profits for privatized profits. That very much fits with the lens of exploitation, taking value that is and not giving a fair return for it. And then similarly on the manipulation front, like we're not plausibly marionettes individually being manipulated in this way, but we are subject to a stochastic manipulation as populations as a whole, where even though for any given one of us, there's a very low probability of our behavior being affected, when you max out over a population of 330 million people, like in the US, you actually can have significant impacts. And obviously, we've seen that to a certain degree with elections, with referenda, and I think more broadly with the effects that online recommender systems have had on public discourse, where, it's a super complicated topic that I write about elsewhere. But on the whole, it's definitely not good. And it's something that, like, it's about these very little effects on lots of individual people amassing to something in the aggregate that's really significant, which is just like, I think, an interesting insight as well about machine learning generally. I feel like that's a good metaphor for a lot of what machine learning does. It takes these very, very small little bits of data, or whatever it might be, of insight, and brings them all together so you can actually get something useful out of them, given the political economy that surrounds that. The useful part is generally, thus far, has been used towards advancing the profits of a few tech companies. So that's the punchline in the end.
I think on that, I mean, thank you very much for walking through that. I would encourage people to go read the article if they're interested in it. I think it's a really good example to me of what I like about a lot of your articles, where reading that, I don't know. I sort of have that same intuition of like, yeah, something bad about social media privacy. I don't really know why. And this like splitting it apart into, oh, there's kind of the individual parts and the structural parts made it a lot easier for me to understand like, oh, okay, that is an interesting way of thinking about this that I didn't have before. And now that you're talking about this with LLM training, it kind of maps very nicely onto that. There's something that feels wrong about like, yeah, we're just scooping up all of these images and text and all of this other stuff for training systems without really legally having to give anything back. Most of the value of this is created because of all the stuff that other people have created. And it feels weird and it feels wrong in like a structural sense, not in an individual sense. Like, of course, as you know, OpenAI had their blog posts where they're like, oh, like, New York Times, like, your articles don't make up a very large fraction of our training data. Sure, but you can't say that to everyone because then you would have no training data, right? So, like, how do we reconcile that as a society, and like, what's the right place for regulation or whatever? I think at least this philosophically gives like a good reason why there is some harm there. It's like the structural part, not the individual one.
Yeah. And you see that with like, and it has been frustrating. Like, I'm very supportive of a lot of the movement by artists to push back against generative AI and the way in which it's used their work. But you find exactly the same normative misframing in almost all of the stuff that they put out. It's always about you're stealing my work, which implies again that your work is a difference maker. And it just isn't. No individual's work is a difference maker. And it was the same with all the privacy stuff. Like I said at the beginning, I deleted all of my stuff from Facebook for all the good it did me, you know? So I'm still just as predictable to Facebook because they've got enough data about me and they've got enough data about other people that they can produce predictive models that are just as accurate for me as they would be if they actually had my data to train on. So treating this as an individual problem is like just fundamentally mistaken. And it leads to these sort of individual responses that don't fix anything. The stability thing where you could opt out, you could go through, find your pictures and remove them from the training data. Like as an individual response to an individual problem, that would be in principle adequate, but it obviously isn't. It's terrible. So what I think we should really be thinking about with these things is it's the structural level. And like, so take the art question. I think that we need to think about what creative economy we want to have. And what we should look at is we have, for whatever reason, we've had a creative economy where we have subsidized, or artists have been able to subsidize their truly creative work by doing low-level illustration type work. That's been a way to get by. As a photographer, I used to do weddings. And it wasn't that like I liked doing weddings. It was that actually it's a huge amount of pressure and it's not the most interesting subject matter. You can make a lot of money out of doing it. And it's just a way of sustaining yourself. And then you do the creative work that you really want to do, but doesn't necessarily make you a living. So now that's something that is basically going to go. Like that section of the economy of like doing those kind of low level illustrations is just going to be handled by AI. And like, okay, that's a big change. Is the answer to that we like, I don't know, ban generative AI or whatever it might be, or make sure that for every image that's created, some artist gets like some fraction proportionate to the amount of training data that they contributed, which would be like Spotify, but like Spotify to the nth degree reduced, like your returns on any particular thing would be infinitesimal. Obviously not. Like we need to think about, do we want to sustain artists? Do we want to create an economy where people are able to make a living making art? I think we do. Certainly, I think that we should here in Australia. I know America is a more sort of libertarian society. And so we need to have increased funding for the arts. And sure, tax the companies that are making massive profits in order to do that. That's fine too. But that's all like looking at things from this overarching structural perspective, rather than just from the grievance of the individual artist whose work has been used.
One thing that's really interesting in this is that it seems like these grievances are often being articulated in ways that feel immediately legible, right? Like this notion of that was mine and then you took it. We have a notion of property law that I don't have to defend.
And fair right,
Yeah.
fair use.
Fair use.
Yeah.
And so there's this growing, but it seems to me like we've got an emerging set of things that just the world is changing. That as much as we have existing concepts that we can apply and adapt, the example I bring up a lot is so much of our legal order and our moral order is predicated on the fact that I don't have a reasonable basis to expect that you might do particular things because you'd have to have automated your abilities to do that. And then all of a sudden now that automated ability is there. So many
like with the example with cameras before, right?
With
like,
cameras, exactly.
Surveillance, not so bad if like, oh yeah, it all gets recorded and sent somewhere, but no one ever really looks at it except for crimes. Like, okay, sure, whatever. But when it starts to get used, because now we have all these other abilities, it's a very different thing.
The aspects of your work that I get most excited by are the bits that are how do we start to defend these foundational concepts of how legal and moral order work. And I want to take us to, I'm going to be, this will probably say, I'm going to take all of your tenor lecture and reduce it to just one thing right now. And perhaps not as bad as rewriting your headlines, but it's but I wanted to go to the point about resistibility as a concept in law, because I think that that's something that a lot of people, period, struggle with. And I think for a lot of engineers, and Josh, you can poke me if you think this isn't fair, but I think a lot of engineers, the mental model is, I will solve the problem. So if we have a problem, then let me remove that. But resistibility, this idea that the law could be correct or justified or whatever it is that allows the consensus for it to come to existence, and I still can resist, is actually, I think, a fundamental quality that a lot of us believe but may not be able to articulate. And I'd just love to hear more about how you see that playing out in a world in which you have these machines that pretend like they can make the right decision all the time. And we're going to venture towards them making a lot of the right decision. The right decision might be dangerous.
Yeah, good. So the background to this is that I was trying to think through the ways in which like algorithmic governance differs from other modalities of governance. So there's been since the late 90s, early 2000s, there's been this sense of like the way in which code can shape behavior that has been advanced by people like Larry Lessig and others that treats code as being in some ways similar to or equivalent to law. In the same way as law can determine what's possible for you to do as well as what's permissible for you to do, code can too. And I think that the use of AI to govern people's behavior, to shape people's behavior, kind of adds an extra layer to that, where instead of it just being this deterministic set of parameters that you operate within, you actually have something that is functionally indeterministic, that is effectively making decisions and shaping your behavior. So just as one example of this, to give it a bit of concreteness, think about the way in which constitutional AI works, right? So constitutional AI coming out of Anthropic, this really cool idea that you can align a language model's behavior by giving it a set of principles and essentially having a language model itself evaluate whether one of two given completions to a prompt better satisfies one of those principles than the other, and uses that to then learn this constitution and then apply it. So that when you use the model, it will only generate responses that are more or less consistent with that constitution. Now, what this relies on is like the way that that whole method works is it draws randomly from the list of principles. So it never actually, in the training process, draws on multiple principles and figures out or is told how to weigh them against one another. So when you're actually using Claude, it's obviously going to face situations where, in principle, like more than one of its principles would apply. And the process by which the model is actually synthesizing or trading off or deciding between those principles is entirely done by the language model itself. There's no human instruction that goes into that at all. So your ability to use this model, language model, to get it to say something controversial, say, is now being shaped by the model itself. You're being governed by the AI system itself. So that's an example of algorithmic governance. And the thing about algorithmic governance is that it's a lot harder to resist than it is to resist the law. Resisting the law is often has significant consequences, don't get me wrong. There can be secondary means by which you can prevent people from resisting the law. You can have downstream implications, but it has less of a role of like, because it doesn't directly shape your behavior and shape your options, you still have the option to disregard it, right? There is this sort of scope for you to disobey. There may be consequences, but you have the option to disobey. This is really interesting with AI because you may not have the option to disobey. Like I mean, we'll get to prompt engineering and prompt injection and ways of kind of getting around the methods of aligning language models. But in principle, you can design these things in such a way that you can't get around them, right? You're just left with the means that are available to you. Now, this is really interesting as a political philosopher because, like, in many ways, the central question of political philosophy has always been predicated on the idea that you can disobey the law, right? So the central question of political philosophy for many people has been, do you have an obligation to obey the law? Which is another way of saying, like, why does somebody get to tell you what to do and you have to obey it, right? And you have to say, like, you might have to obey it even in a situation where you know there won't be consequences. So, like, do you have an obligation, for example, to obey the speed limit even when there's no one else around, right? And this is like a really interesting central question. It's animated everyone from Hobbes and Locke through Rawls, Marx, all these other people. And if you can govern people in such a way that they don't have the option of disobeying, then that question becomes moot. And so as a political philosopher, it's just really interesting to think about what it would be like to have an environment or a society in which disobedience simply wasn't an option, like how we would evaluate that. It sounds like it'd be terrible to me because it removes this scope for freedom. Now, obviously, one reason it would be terrible would be that the law very likely wouldn't be perfectly just. And so one reason why we need to have resistance and that option of disobedience is a kind of one of like reforming the law, like making sure that we recognize the need and ability to challenge the law when it's unjust. That's an obvious reason why it's a problem, but still a really important one. I think that there is also a more fundamental reason that like stripping us of the option of resisting and of disobeying fundamentally undermines our autonomy in a way that even if it's just about removing options that are impermissible for us, is still deeply problematic. And I think that there's just this temptation with algorithmic governance to go down that route. There was a funny, this has happened a lot with some of the decentralized DSOs, what they're called, I can't remember the acronym. These organizations that are trying to sort of work around decentralized finance, around blockchain, in order to create methods of governance that don't rely on law and on existing patterns of regulation. And one of the famous quotes from them was like, Google's original motto was, don't be evil or something like that. Don't be evil. Like that's the motto. It's an injunction. It's like it's asking you to do it. And they wanted to replace that with can't do evil, like can't be bad. Like make it the case that it's not possible for you to do the thing that is impermissible. That's like an aspiration I think that one has when one starts doing this kind of algorithmic governance stuff. It's a little bit like what you get with institutional design in general. You want to try and make the institutions so that they afford better outcomes as much as possible. But I think that like treating it as like actually make it impossible to do the wrong thing. First of all, it's probably like there's probably always going to be like ways in which you can get around any kind of structure, whatever it might be. But also, it fundamentally undermines the choice to actually obey, which I think is actually one of the more humanistic and autonomy affirming parts of the law that you lose when you shift to algorithmic governance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's really interesting how I think emotionally resonant this point is. When I was home for Christmas, the number of times I had people needling me about like something that like products that we have nothing to do with, do or don't do. But one was like this young man who was outraged that he couldn't get ChatGPT to tell him dirty jokes. And he was this high school kid. And it was clearly about this on the edge of deviance where we discover ourselves sort of in confrontation with authority, that there's something about us as people that we lose when we can't push those boundaries. And I think there's something like really intrinsic in that it gets lost in a lot of these debates about what an ideal system would look like. And so,
I mean, making it like very grounded, using the Anthropic example, like what does a better version of this look like, right? Like how do we actually make something better, or do we not make these things at all? Or like, yeah, some thoughts on like what alternatives there are?
Yeah, good. Matt, to your point, Jamie Susskind, this writer and barrister from London, has this awesome phrase, the hinterland of naughtiness, which I think is really great for some of this stuff. When you're able to just rule out behaviors ex ante, you start removing that area of experimentation that is just this borderline stuff. So what he calls naughtiness. I think that's really important. I think more generally, like as long as we're not talking about really extreme stuff, I think that like in general, it's just better to have people have the option of doing the wrong thing, but then be able to do the right thing and like have subsequent consequences. I think it just is more affirming of people's autonomy. Mm-hmm. As to like what that would look like with language models in particular, I think it's really interesting to think about in this context some of the work that's just come out through OpenAI's Democratic Inputs to AI project, or sort of series of projects, in conjunction with also what Anthropic has done with its collective constitutional AI. One way to think about it is like, okay, so one way we can have autonomy in the context of norms that constrain us is if we have like authorship over those norms. So this is the classic Rousseauian idea of the foundations of law, that law doesn't make you unfree if you are part author of those laws. And so one way to respond to that in the context of Claude would be like, okay, well, if we have a process of consultation and co-authorship of the Constitution, then when it constrains us subsequently, we get our autonomy through that process of democratization. So that's one aspect of it. I think on the whole, though, that like a lot of the thinking about governing language models has been it's a little bit out over its skis, in as much as I think that like it seems very, very likely that systems like this are going to play a very significant governing role in people's lives in the future. They're going to be used by governments, for example, to analyze, and already are being used to analyze intelligence data and then to enact like really, really significant penalties on people. So stuff like that is definitely going to happen. What we're using them for at the moment is like generating text and pictures. And that's kind of a fairly low stakes context. And so in that context, like the best solution here is very much you have appropriate democratic regulation of these sorts of tools. So you don't need to have necessarily like democratic input into the constitution for Claude if you already have democratic input into the governance of language models in this particular use case. That creates a set of parameters. And then within that, what you really want to have is a well-functioning market that gives people the choice of different tools that they can use. So if you want to make your dirty jokes, you've got another language model that's just as good that can do dirty jokes for you. And so I think that's kind of where, again, the kind of the structural versus individual perspective becomes really important. Like we're at a stage where those sorts of problems we should really be solving with institutional design, i.e., in particular, by making sure that we don't get too much market concentration, that we don't get too much vertical integration. So in a way, I would say that the thing that should be most of concern in that context is less like how specifically Claude governs you and more the advent of the GPT store, for example, from OpenAI, and this push for vertical integration where they're also investing in chip makers. Like what I'm worried about is when you get one company that has the hardware, has the foundation models, has the customer interface, has the business to business interface, and is then able to take a really significant part of the market so that we don't have any real choice. So we only have ChatGPT to use in this context, or ChatGPT and Claude, and both of them are equally priggish. That's where I think we fix these problems. I do think, though, that like there is this interesting theoretical question about what it means to be governed algorithmically that I just think is sort of intrinsically fascinating in its own right, because nobody knows. And I've spoken with engineers and researchers at Anthropic. They don't know how Claude weighs different principles against one another. What it could be doing is it could be doing a sort of like something a little bit like a mixture of experts thing, where it initially sorts the prompt and decides, okay, well, this prompt most applies to this principle. So it doesn't actually do any trading off at all. It just kind of allocates it to that. That would be interesting. That's not how a human applying those principles would do it, but it's like an interesting thing. Or it might be relying on the degree to which it's been trained on these things. So, given that it's been trained randomly among these different principles, it gives them all the same amount of weight. And if you were to train it more on like the principles that are like about human rights and on the ones that are about, I don't know, not telling dirty jokes, then it would give those more weight. Or alternatively, the most interesting possibility is that the language model is actually relying on its own underlying understanding of the concepts that are at play, and on that basis, giving some of them more weight than others. I think that's an interesting problem for us to think about, especially as we go on into that future where these systems are playing a bigger governing role. But at present, when it comes to dirty jokes, I think the solution really is well-functioning market, making sure that in different countries, like I think sovereign capability is really important because like beyond the dirty jokes, I think there's a real sort of universalization of Silicon Valley values that is a real risk. So I don't want Australia to have its citizens' advice language agents using ChatGPT. I want them to be using something that is trained here and not just fine-tuned here, but actually is deeply, has Australian values like deeply embedded. So those, I think, are the kind of interventions that we should get to reach the sort of pluralism that we want.
Yeah, I guess I feel a little bit worried or skeptical about the actual outcome on this particular issue, and that there does seem to be a drive towards concentration. I mean, just in markets in general in the US. And I mean, we have Microsoft and Google and Apple and like these large tech companies for a reason, right? Like there's not thousands of different phone operating systems, right? And a lot of the reason is that, it requires large amounts of capital to create these technologies. It requires large amounts of capital. We can only have so many places with large amounts of capital. Okay, you kind of end up with like, well, you're going to have like a small number of companies that are able to make their own chips, that are able to gather all the training data, et cetera. So I guess I do feel a little bit worried about where we'll end up. Although I do agree that the opposite world would certainly be better from this perspective of this issue.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that like there's some small cause for optimism, at least, in as much as I do think with language models and with this whole approach to I think that you have somewhat fewer network effects than you do, for example, with platforms and with even in some cases with some of the devices. I think that the level of concentration that we've seen with online platforms and with some types of tech hardware like iPhone and what have you I think that there's reason for optimism that it won't be that extreme, largely because I think that the network effects that you get, especially for a social media platform, based on like it really makes a difference what other people are using to you as a consumer. Like I'm still on Twitter as much as I hate it because it's the only place I can find the sort of AI news that I want to get because other people are still on it. And I think that on the whole, with language, like of course you get lots of benefit. I mean, more people use your model, it gives you more data to refine it on, of course. But it's not the case that for me as a consumer, if I have something, if I want to use an agent based on a language model, for example, it isn't necessarily in my interest to use the same one as someone else is using. So if other people are using one, then I benefit from using it as well. And that I think is an affordance of this particular technology that does make it give me more reason for optimism. I think similarly, if we can continue increasing locally available computational resources to the degree that you can start running these things very successfully locally, that I think means that at inference time, you do have, again, more opportunity for more decentralization. So, I think that's true. I do think that compute is a huge bottleneck. And one of the things I think has been sneaky and like frustrating has been the way in which the big tech companies really weren't, in many ways, at the forefront of this latest revolution. I mean, obviously, some of the foundational research was done at Google Brain, but there's a reason why it wasn't picked up to the same degree by Google as it was by OpenAI because it wasn't kind of part of the platform AI like flywheel of generating more data to generate more ads and to better target ads and so on. Like that whole ecosystem, language models fit into that in a certain way, like help you do better searches or whatever, but not really, it's not really part of it in the same way as, for example, we're using recommender systems for allocating content to optimize for engagement really is part of the core business model. So that's one reason why we get this new generation of tech companies, but at the same time, they're ultimately reliant on compute that these companies, the other companies have just cornered the market in. And so Microsoft can just like take this cut from every time anyone uses ChatGPT. They're getting the nice little buzz on in their data center and getting their little bit of it. And that I think is a really interesting and frustrating feature, the way that big tech, because of its monopoly over, or it's not monopoly, but it's significant amounts of compute, is advancing the concentration of these resources. One of these things, just on that compute part, I recently watched the movie Blackberry, which was super fun. Like apparently it's mostly made up, but it was a really, really enjoyable story. And the thing at the end of it, where the BlackBerry guys were seeing the iPhone come up and seeing how much data it used, and they were like, why would anybody want to use something that is so data hungry? We can get you your email with a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of data that's using. It's going to cost people so much. It's so profligate in resources. And then one of the guys has a phone call with the CEO of AT&T, who basically says, like, dummy, that's why it's good for us. Like before we were only selling minutes, now we're able to sell data packages. That's the thing that we actually make the money from. And I think that there's been a really interesting parallel with language models where everyone's been going, oh, they're so resource intensive. Oh, they're using so much computation. It's really bad. Like they're so inefficient. And it's like, yes, and all of that is happening on someone's data center somewhere, likely Microsoft's for OpenAI stuff. And that's making Microsoft a ton of money and, made them now the most valuable company in the world. So I think that kind of aspect of the political economy of it and the underlying compute infrastructure is one that is not enough people are paying close enough attention to, and is for me the thing that, yeah, like you said, makes me most pessimistic about the prospect of enabling a form of decentralized and sort of reducing the concentration of power with AI going forward.
Let's talk about localization because I feel like it has this quality. There's some academic discourse around this idea that there's this cultural imperialism projecting Silicon Valley on the world. But I think back to early days of the internet and just how much a lot of places, just that free flow of information, this new possibility of things broke with the local norms. The local norms stink, right? It's a surveillance is not new and it seems to be better implemented under certain regimes than others. And so there is this really interesting philosophical challenge of this. There's one is a projection of power to share or to shape how people are going to interact with the things you create for them. But there's another where if it's sufficiently liberating or providing access to information or doing things that the powerful might not want it to do, it's liberating. And so how do how do we even begin to think about balancing that, both as you're creating products, but also as you're creating rules?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like I think sort of sovereign capability and the ability to incorporate local norms feels a lot more attractive when you're talking about like a liberal democracy than when you're talking about something like, I don't know, Hungary, say. For Hungary to have their own sovereign capability in LLMs and agents is something that makes me, makes one much more worried. And we've seen this as well with content moderation. On the one hand, having people in Silicon Valley decide what counts as acceptable political discourse in your country seems to suck. On the other hand, having the BJP in India telling Twitter to remove anything that's critical is also really bad. There's a really nice paper. I can't remember the name of the author, but the paper is titled Digital Switzerland. The thesis is that some sort of separation of powers is really important in governing online communication. And I think this goes for governing sort of anything in general. So what you want to aspire to is some measure of separation of powers. We've had that accidentally through some of the capabilities that big tech has had, and sometimes that has worked in people's interests. So for example, with Apple's refusal to enable the US government to unlock certain devices, like that I think is something that preserves people's fundamental rights. Sometimes it works against us when, for example, around the COVID apps, Apple and Google basically decided what was an acceptable trade-off between privacy and public health and made it the case that you could only get a COVID app to work if you agreed with them or if you accepted their constraint, which I think was an overstepping of their power. So I think it really does require a careful thought about like who should get to wield what kinds of power, and designing systems that enable checks and balances so that it isn't all concentrated is really important. And I think in the absence of good constitutional liberal democracies, having a sort of fallback where an outside company plays some of that role in interest of human rights is something that can probably be justified. I do on the whole think that like where you've got a constitutional liberal democracy that is in pretty good shape, the companies should for the most part, and I think that unless they're dealing with real fundamental basic human rights that a constitutional, even a liberal democracy shouldn't be able to abrogate, I think that that's where the line should be drawn. But obviously the companies don't necessarily want to be deciding which countries meet the threshold of being sufficiently liberal and democratic for them to defer appropriately. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a really tricky question. I mean, it goes back to this thing that I think is like one of the messages that I've been trying to get across to a lot of folks in computer science, which speaks in a way to some of the stuff we were talking about right at the beginning, is that they often think about the normative dimensions of the design of these technologies solely through the lens of like, we want to make sure that the outcomes that are realized are ones that we endorse, are good ones. So like they're thinking about, are these technologies going to be used to benefit people? Are they going to be safe? These sorts of things. They don't think about the way in which these technologies are being used to exercise power and the different kinds of justificatory questions that raises beyond just the one. Obviously, one of the things that matters when you're using power is, are you doing so in a way that is justified? If your government is making decisions that lead to famine, say, then that's obviously a problem. You want governments to work in a way that leads to sort of the flourishing of their population, sports equality, and all those sorts of things. But substantive justification isn't the only thing that matters. It also matters both how power is exercised and who it is exercised by. So how power is exercised speaks to these questions of procedural legitimacy. Like, are you making decisions in a way that people actually have sufficient visibility into, that they can contest, that you can explain to them in the event that you need to? And then the question of who gets to exercise power is really important. And that goes back to this one. Like, is it appropriate that an unelected, unaccountable executive at a company far away from your country is making these significant decisions about how you're able to communicate online, how you're able to use your AI tools? Or should that be something that is a decision that is made by people within your country? If it's people within your country, like, it's not enough that it just be, they are your compatriots, right? It needs to be the case that they are exercising power with the appropriate authority to do so. Mm-hmm. And like, if it's the BJP in India and they're clearly overstepping their constitutional boundaries, or else they've changed the constitution in such a way that it is contradictory to your fundamental rights, then they also lack proper authority. So really, like, one of the things that I've been trying to encourage people to think about is these questions of like, who ought to be making these decisions? If we're talking about, how these tools are going to be used or how language models are going to be used, who are the appropriate people to make those decisions? Not just like what would be a good decision or a bad decision.
Mm-hmm. I think one of your papers, I think it was probably the first one that Matt shared with me that I really liked actually, was the legitimacy, authority, and democratic duties of explanation, which I think gets into all of these ideas in a lot more detail. And I was very happy to read through that. I'm not sure if there's anything else in that paper that you didn't just cover, but if you want to give a brief overview of anything else that you missed.
Yeah, I mean, the idea there was, it was to try and make the case for this and like why this matters from a political, philosophical perspective. And basically the idea is that, yeah, so legitimacy is about doing things the right way. Authority is about like being the right person to do it, having the right to rule effectively. And yeah, the argument of that paper was basically that like explanations were particularly important because if you're not able to explain certain types of decisions where you're exercising power, there's no way for us to know that you have the authority to exercise it. And there's no way for us to check whether you're following the appropriate procedures. And the basic thesis of the paper is that in the absence of those, like if you can't tell whether you're being governed legitimately or with proper authority, then like automatically you're not being governed legitimately with proper authority. It's a value that is conditional on your being able to actually perceive it or to assess it and evaluate it. That was my way of getting in at this literature on explainable AI, which I had felt like there were all these cool techniques for making machine learning models more explainable, but there was really not a lot of like motivation for why we should be doing it. There's some obvious instrumental reasons, like if you can explain a system, then you can intervene on it more successfully. And so you're able to shape its behavior better. And if you're subject to a system, if it's explainable, then it's predictable. And if it's predictable, you can shape your own behavior in such a way that it better conforms to it. And like those things really matter for sure, but they're fairly thin rule when it comes to normative justification. So I wanted to get at like why it was that the idea of being subject to, an arbitrary, completely quasi-mystical authority is something that makes most of us feel super uncomfortable. And even in that case of the Claude case that I mentioned before, like even if the stakes are pretty low as to whether Claude is going to let you make a dirty joke, it still feels weird to have your behavior shaped by something that you no idea why it's trading these principles off against one another in this way. And I think that that paper was getting at like why that is. Like it makes it feel like we're being governed by this Kafkaesque force beyond our control, influence, or understanding. We're just sort of, billiard balls being pushed around by forces beyond our control, which is fundamentally inconsistent with our autonomy.
Yeah, I really liked the pillars that you lay out of, what it requires for you to, like, if you can't tell if you're being governed correctly, you're not being governed correctly. I like that as a sort of like a summary of it, but it had very good specifics about like, well, what does that look like in practice? Like really, like how do you know, like what is enough explanation? And should you be able to see every single detail or all information all the time? No, of course not. Like where are those boundaries, et cetera? So I thought it was a really interesting, and a lot of the stuff that happens in explainability and AI is not necessarily directly related to this. Some of it's instrumental, some of it's honestly a little bit pointless or a little bit flawed or just about features. But other stuff is very connected to this. And, we can make post hoc explanations. When do those make sense? When do they not make sense? Like, is that a reasonable part of this? Or do we want systems that are actually understandable fundamentally? Do we want to trade off some of the performance of the system? We actually had a big debate at our paper club for this about like, would you rather have a system that you can't understand that has sort of better performance, better outcomes, rather than one that like is actually much more understandable, but is just sort of objectively, in some objective sense, like not getting as good a performance. And I think you make a very good case for why actually you do want to sacrifice some performance in these cases. But it's not at all obvious to, I think, a lot of engineers why that is reasonable.
Yeah, the other piece that I just thought was powerful is that often individual components of it. So legitimacy, if I'm allowed to rule, then I think for many people, oh, then that's sort of settled it. And then how I rule is my choice. And those could be nice features and but the idea that they were all on an equal level of importance, that's what I felt was so instructive and really could feed into the design of systems.
The way in which I bring those three questions together is a little bit heterodox within political philosophy. Like there's been a bit of a tendency among political philosophers to only focus on what I call the who question, and to do so only in the context of the state. It really goes back to that question about the obligation to obey the law. And so one of the things that I've enjoyed with working on this stuff, just as a political philosopher, has been how it's forced me to go into areas that political philosophers tend to leave a little bit untapped. And that question of how you rule, there's obviously a lot of legal philosophy on this, but there's a lot of questions around like the exercise of power by states that we don't touch a huge amount. The whole field of administrative law, for example, which going back to something you said before, Matt, is super boring and geeky in one respect, but is very much about like how power is exercised. And we don't have great political theories about it. I think it's really important for thinking about the use of AI in the exercise of power because it very much gets to a lot of those questions within administrative law about like your ability to see before the fact, like what the rules are that apply to you, your ability to know that they're being done transparently and consistently, and then your ability to contest them after the fact. That for me is a central part of what motivates the push for explainability. And it then does like guide how you think about explaining these systems. So I think that this is one reason why it wasn't just a sort of a curiosity thing to figure out like why explainability matters. My hypothesis was very much that like if you don't know why explainability matters, then you're not going to know what kinds of explanations you need. So you're going to get a lot of those blind alleys where it's just like, well, this is an explanation of this thing. It doesn't have any bearing on like why we want explanations itself, but it's just another way of interpreting what a machine learning model is doing. So then in the paper, I do have this sequence of somewhat ad hoc like insights as to like, okay, well, what would we want to explain then if we wanted to know that you're being governed with proper authority? That gets to a range of things, both some of the technical details of like how the machine learning model operates, but also like some of the stuff around it, like where your data is coming from, how you've curated it, the sort of feature importance aspects, what sort of various different counterfactuals would mean for the outcomes that the model projects. So I think that, yeah, that focus on like why this thing that people generally believe matters, like why it matters, then helps shape like how you actually go about satisfying these desiderata.
Yeah.
Another thing that is kind of a through line in a lot of your different works, this one, some of the earlier ones that we talked about, is a lot of it comes back to power. It's like who has power over what? And you have an earlier work, even I think sort of about this, like power and AI, like nature and justification, which I think goes into some of these issues. And I'd love for you to give a little bit of overview of that paper as well. And I just think it's a good thing for people to be thinking about as we're building these systems, like where does this power go? Like what makes it legitimate? What doesn't? Like thinking about how making more and more sophisticated AI systems will change the balance of power. Like, do we want that? How do we want to change that? How do we want to affect it? They just seem like important questions that are not really the direct questions that we're asking as engineers when we're making these things day to day.
Yeah, for sure. And like, so when I started working on this stuff, I was always in the circles. I'm with the more social science, the humanities side of these things. I was hearing lots and lots of people talking about power, saying everything should be about power. We should stop thinking about bias, start thinking about power, these sorts of things. And very few people actually saying what they meant by that and why that was something we should focus on. And oftentimes it really felt as though the whole ethos of these sort of approaches was just that to name power was enough to criticize it.
Yeah.
Like all you need to do is say, this thing is exercising this power at stake here. And that's like automatically bad. This goes back to a tradition of Michel Foucault and a kind of underlying libertarianism that views as this sort of this implicit, never fully worked out suspicion of the power that some have over others in a context where like there's a lack of desire to make explicit normative arguments. It goes to that thing of like people just assuming that their audience is going to agree with them about the normative standards that they're applying. So I was troubled by that because I recognized the ways in which power was at stake, but it felt to me like it wasn't getting an adequate normative shake. So I tried to sort of parse it out and read and thought a lot about like what it means to say that power is at stake. And I focused like there's lots of different ways you can think about power. You can think about like power as like enhancing capability, so your power to do something. You can think about structural power, so the way in which institutions shape the advantages that are available to you. So the way, for example, if you're white in America, the structures of criminal justice and law enforcement are such that you're more likely to be believed and you're able to mobilize police support to advance your interests in a way that is clearly not the case if you're black in America. And then the idea of some people have power over others, or some institutions having power over others. And so that's the last one's what I focus on, like power over. And I think of structural power essentially as being when institutions are structured in such a way that they give some people power over others. So I would say that criminal justice law enforcement in the US are structured in such a way as to give white people power over black people, just generically. So then what does it mean to have some person have power over others? I have a fairly broad definition, like basically just the ability to unilaterally affect other people's well-being, their options, or their prospects and their beliefs and attitudes and desires. So kind of it's a very broad notion where like, if I can unilaterally make you worse off, then I've got power over you. If I can unilaterally change the options that are available to you, shape them, for example, to make it more likely that you do the ones that I'm interested in, then I have power over you. If I can change your attitudes, change your beliefs and desires, make you want something or make you believe something, then I have power over you. And the basic idea was that AI is a force multiplier for power, right? It makes it possible to generate both new power relationships, but also to intensify existing ones. And this goes to some of the stuff we've talked about, like by enabling us to operationalize recorded or captured footage or data about people, in order to gain insights, but also then to shape their behavior. It's giving some people power over others. By actively being deployed in the allocation of benefits and burdens, it's shaping power relations. So if you're using AI to decide whether child welfare is going to knock on someone's door, for example, or how to allocate visas or how to allocate healthcare, then it's being used in the exercise of power. And it's enabling fewer people to exercise more power over more people. So I give this sort of way of quantifying power. I focus on like both the degree of the interests that are at stake, the total magnitude of interest. So like one of the things we talked about is how you could have a small amount of influence over a lot of people, but in the aggregate over a bit of people, that actually makes for a very significant degree of influence. The concentration of power, so how few the number of people is who can shape the behavior of how many. And I think that AI, I mean, digital technologies generally, but AI in particular, has radically changed that ratio. It's made it possible to have extraordinary degrees of power. And then also the scope of the range of choices over which it can influence. One of the things that's interesting about the law, for example, is that it generally tries to operate within a fairly sort of defined scope of human behavior. We try and leave a certain amount of things, like a fairly significant amount of leeway for choices to be such that the law doesn't get much say in them, say romantic decisions, for example. Whereas AI is getting into all of those areas too. So think about the role of dating apps and matching algorithms in that context. That was the general sense to start like, okay, we're talking about power and AI. Like, what does this really mean? What it means is some people are unilaterally able to shape the behavior, options, outcomes of others. Why should that be a concern is the next question. Because like the starting point, the notion that just like power is automatically bad is not very plausible at all. Like a doctor has power over their patients, like an editor has power over the readers of their newspaper. That doesn't mean that you want to get rid of that power. You want to get rid of doctors or whatever. Like sometimes power is justified. And that I think is, again, it's something that the broad critical discourse just doesn't really allow for. Sometimes power is hugely important. Power is necessary. Governing power is necessary to ensure that the strong don't predate on the weak. Governing power is what guarantees equality insofar as we've ever been able to achieve it. The starting point then was to say, okay, well, why are we inherently or intuitively suspicious of power? Why, if we see there are new and intensified power relations, like should our normative ears prick up? And there, like I gave a very quick argument, but it's developed in more length in other things that I've written. I think it's true that like there are these three pretty core values for liberal democracies that power is presumptively in tension with. So one of them is individual liberty, fairly obviously. If someone else is able to unilaterally affect your behavior, you're presumptively at less liberty than you would otherwise be. Another one is equality. If A has power over B, then that creates relations of hierarchy between them. That is presumptively problematic if you're an egalitarian. And then what I call collective self-determination. So that's like the notion that if A has power over B, C, and D, then presumptively that means that A, B, C, and D aren't collectively shaping the shared terms of their social existence. And that's also problematic if you think that collective self-determination matters, as many of us do. Everybody who supports Ukraine's right to defend itself against Russian annexation thinks that it matters that people get to shape their own countries for themselves. And so power is presumptively objectionable, but that doesn't mean that it can't be justified. And so this is where we come to the question of like, so how do we justify power? And that's where the three questions that I mentioned, the what question, the who question, the how question are really important. What are you using it to do? How are you using it? And who's using it? And like sometimes the what question is the only one you need to answer. Like in an emergency situation, if you've just crash landed on a desert island and someone needs to take charge, otherwise we're not going to be able to splint the broken legs and save the lives we need to save and get water to survive through the night, then maybe in that case, all that matters is that the person who's in charge is capable and is able to get people to do the right things. So there can be situations like that. But generally, we don't want to rely only on that kind of emergency justification. It's also one that can be very easily abused. Trump talking about being a dictator on day one. That's what he means by it. He's saying it's a sufficiently emergency situation at the border, say, that it doesn't matter how we apply these other constraints on power. It's enough that I do what I believe to be substantively justified. Like those emergency situations can be abused. You don't want to be relying on that justification all the time. So that's when the how and the who justifications are also really important. And that for me felt like a set of normative architecture. It's a distillation of insights from political philosophy, some of which are fairly familiar, but which felt to me like really was lacking from the discussion in AI ethics that really needed to be brought across. And that, yeah, I hope that people, when they're designing these systems, thinking about how impactful they're going to be on people's lives, are thinking about like, yeah, how will that power be used? Are they making sure that it'll be sufficiently contestable, that people will be able to sort of know in advance the rules that are applying to them? And like, who should be making these decisions? Is it the case that the people who are designing it are getting extraordinary power? Are they investing really significant power in bosses in companies? One of the things I think is really interesting, going back to the running example we've had of Zoom surveillance, is that these things are just rolled out when you have software as a service. It's just an update. And everyone has to update Zoom because you've got to make sure you've got the latest security things. So the university mandates that you update it, or your employer mandates you update it. And the decision then just goes through, often in an organization like a university. It probably doesn't even necessarily get up to the chief information security officer. Often it's just some tech admin somewhere who has got the decision whether to flip this switch on or off. Should I surveil our employees? Should we make surveillance possible or not? And like, that's just not at all right. Like, it's a decision that really should be centrally, like in this context, it should be central to collective bargaining, what we call enterprise bargaining agreements. It should be something that employees collectively negotiate with management. And that's something that one needs to be aware of in designing these systems as well. Like, are you just creating these affordances for those with power to exercise way more power over their employees? And we've seen some funny examples of this, like when Teams rolled out that awful attention monitoring thing for online meetings during the pandemic. And it was just like, oh, there's this new thing. Let's try it out. And everyone was just like, oh, it's horrible. Get rid of it. But like, that's a really important question. Like, are you just enabling managers to kind of massively overmanage their staff? Are you giving them really unacceptable levels of power over their employees? That's something that one needs to think about. And obviously, all the more so for governments. The people who are willing to deploy and build LLMs for intelligence purposes, that is an extraordinary, extraordinary moral risk, and just one that I think they should be really thinking very, very seriously about. I was worried to see that OpenAI had removed that constraint from their policies, because I mean, look, we're seeing it already in Israel with the use of AI for target selection there. This stuff can be used in very unjustified ways. But more importantly, like, it can give those who already have a ton of power even more power over the people who are subject to them. And that's something that one needs to be very cautious about.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I liked about, in particular, the legitimacy, authority, and democratic duties of explanation is that it gives a sort of framework for thinking about, like, okay, at least as an engineer, I can start to think about what are the things I'm supposed to be putting in here, like what kinds of things can I do to kind of help make this more legible or more reasonable or like a better setup. Like, I have a gradient, I have like a way to push things towards something better, as opposed to, I mean, a lot of the time with philosophy or ethics or whatever, people just sort of complaining or this like, oh yeah, surveillance is bad, data, okay, like what am I supposed to do? But here I felt like I had more options about what to do and how to make things better. Similarly, actually, in the other paper, the communicative justice one, I felt I had a similar thing after that of like, oh, I can kind of understand a little bit more about like what are some directions that would be good or bad along this particular issue.
And I think also a bar for what's good enough. Because one of the things that we'll observe, I mean, it's not to be unkind, but something like, take constitutional AI, right? What that really is essentially like, let's sound like we correspond with this set of values, which is quite different from, you've inculcated or learned against a set of values. And when you declare victory, when you say that you've actually gone far enough, I think is an important thing, because we've seen this repeatedly, even if you think Web 2.0, there's a lot of, there's like a dashboard where you could go in and, toggle boxes on what you can or can't do, what people can or can't do with your data, but all the defaults are set to surveil you all the time. Anything until you've toggled those things, all of your data has been used in a certain way. And so, reality is so far from the bar that we want to have. And so I think actually putting in mind what legitimacy really looks like, I think is an important thing and a challenge when you're building systems, because it actually is a lot harder to build systems possessed of that legitimacy.
Yeah, it's not to say that the paper lays out like this is exactly how to do it, but at least ask the right,
for sure.
Give some tools and frameworks for thinking about these.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, like, I do take that side of things seriously. And actually, in my recent work, or in my current work, I'm trying to think more from that perspective of, like, how do you actually build things that test out these values, obviously in collaboration with computer scientists. And I think that part of that is also about being able to shift around from pure critique to actually thinking about positive justification. That speaks a bit to the concern that you had there, Josh, that like there's a lot of like scolding that goes on in this area. And like some of it is perfectly warranted scolding. Like, don't get me wrong, the scolding is justified. But also, like, it lacks like, well, okay, so what should I do instead?
Mhm.
Should we just give up on all this stuff? Do we just abolish it? Like some people think so. I don't think that's plausible. I don't think it's morally plausible, let alone whether it would actually happen. I think that these technologies do create extraordinary opportunities. Speaking to the communicative justice point, I think our ability to form a kind of democratic public has been radically enhanced by availability of the internet and, in fact, of algorithms for recommendation and sorting of public online communication. I don't think we've achieved that promise by any means, but I think that the capability is there, and it's one that we should absolutely take advantage of. I think that with language models, there are some really promising potential uses to support democracy, for example, that I think that we should be taking advantage of, let alone the fact that people are going to use it and you can't just like, it's just not plausibly something that you could ban. Like, we don't just ban stuff because we think it's morally not very nice. Like, you have a presumption in favor of freedom, and if people want to do it, they want to do it. Something like AI companions, for example, lots of people think that those are kind of gross, but you don't get to ban something just because you think it's gross. So the question then is like, okay, well, how would you design one that would be safe and would be appropriate in various different ways? It wouldn't cross certain kinds of thresholds. What should it be aiming for? What would count as a good version of that? And so, yeah, that's like, again, it's a really fun thing to do as a political philosopher, as a moral philosopher. In the same way as with the What's Wrong with Automated Influence paper, you're trying to understand the source of the moral criticism of something. Here, the counterpart is you're trying to articulate an ideal. And I do think that this is one of the areas where there's sort of low hanging fruit, the potential for an early proof of concept for the societal benefit of LLMs that goes significantly beyond you're just able to produce better marketing copy for your website or whatever, which is your sort of your Jaspers and that kind of thing. Which, like, yeah, okay, it has economic value, but it doesn't have a lot of social value. And like the amount of craft that is on the internet now being generated by these things really sucks. Whereas I think that we've done a lot of complaining over the last 10 years about the state of the public discourse online and the condition of the digital public sphere. I don't think we've done enough articulating what we want it to look like.
Mhm.
Most of the time, it's just like we don't want it to be polarizing, for example. We don't want it to lead to a fraction epistemic landscape. But we now actually have resources available to us to shape it in a much more intentional way towards those positive values. So, what should they be? The paper has this kind of whole discussion. Like, I try and frame this idea of communicative justice as a topic for political philosophers to engage with. Part of that involves some sort of like housekeeping around how do you distinguish this value from freedom of expression, which has largely been the quasi-positive normative ideal people have aimed at. I think it's in many ways not fit for purpose. And so, like, we need to think about communication largely because our novel capability, the thing that AI enables now, the power that enables, is this very fine-grained ability to provide people with an audience and to decide on the audience that they have. It's not just about expression, it's about actually connecting you up with a platform. And that for me goes beyond what we've enabled previously with the control that editors have over what's on the front page of their newspaper, for example. So you need to separate it out from freedom of expression. And then, like, I gave a framework to think about it. Like, what are the interests that are at stake in communication and what are the principles for their distribution? And then I came back again to the sort of the who, how, what kind of framing as well. And then there's this sort of cheeky little bit at the end where I float this idea, which I'm starting to see a couple of people have also had the same notion about the potential that LLMs offer for offering an alternative to the existing recommender system approach that has been, like, at the very least complicit in some of the pathologies of the digital public sphere. Like, it's overstating it to say that the sole reason. Everyone who goes on about like, oh, the problems of the algorithm, all that, it's all very much the same as the Zuboff stuff about automated influence. It doesn't allow sufficiently for the role of human agency and the fact that, like, we collectively are to blame for the ways in which things suck, and it's not all just like some Deus ex machina that's doing it. But at the same time, they definitely have been complicit, and engagement optimization sucks. And there are various kind of affordances of recommender systems that are bad, like they rely on live behavioral data. They fit very well with the whole surveillance data harvesting economy. And that's like how they work, and that's how they're going to work. And they rely on indirect signals to figure out what you like. So it's always going to be only your revealed preferences and always very crudely revealed. So they're always going to be optimizing for engagement. That's the proxy that they can focus on. Whereas LLMs, like, they can understand content just by understanding it. And they can understand your preferences just by talking to you about your preferences, including like your higher order preferences, what you want to want, not just what you want. And they can reason between the two. So they can make an inference that given that you have these preferences, you might like this content. Best of all, soon enough, you'll be able to get that inference power locally without relying on the cloud or relying on a provider like Google to do it. Obviously, Google will have a version of it that probably will work better or be more efficient or whatever. But maybe Apple will have a version. They'll call themselves, the same way as they say you have a human right to privacy and we're going to protect you against these nasty companies trying to take your privacy. You have a human right to allocate your attention appropriately, and we're going to guard your attention. So there's ways in which the affordances of LLMs are the basis for recommendation and filtering of online communication push away from the centralization of power that you've had with existing recommender systems in ways that could be really, really empowering and exciting. That's an example for me of how you go beyond just scolding from the sidelines and start actually figuring out, okay, what are the things you would love to see built? I went through the whole post Elon Musk Twitter takeover, the shift to Mastodon, and like reverse cron as a means of organizing your online feed absolutely sucks. I hate it. And I really want to find out, like, I think that it plays a really important role. Like, my part of the public sphere, my corner of the public sphere has been deeply impoverished since Musk's takeover of Twitter. And I think that that's partly because we just don't have access to a viable alternative to those kinds of really problematic forms of filtering and recommendation. And I think that LMs do provide a resource for doing that. At the moment, it seems like it would be extraordinarily computationally intensive. So I'm not sure how it would actually become feasible. But that's where people like you are going to solve those problems. And
That's right. We'll have to make it 1,000,000 times cheaper, and then
yeah,
that is something that we, are interested in making these systems more accessible. Not, I mean, the one way is to make them kind of cheaper, right? And to make it so it's 1,000,000 times cheaper, and you can use your LLM to do whatever. But another thing I think that's interesting to us is putting these LLMs together into larger systems, into agents that can do a better job of actually understanding, or of going and finding that information for you, of summarizing it, or of the kind of like larger cognitive tasks that we would expect from our sort of future or near future AI systems. That's something that we're pretty interested in. And I know that you've also been thinking about agents. And I think another piece of this, the agents are like other things that we've talked about here. And technology has sort of both sides, right? It's very powerful and very interesting. Like, yes, okay, we can make these agents that can find all this information, etc. But in the beginning, is that just going to exacerbate power differences? Like, is it just going to be me? Because like, oh, okay, I have enough money living in Silicon Valley to like afford to pay for this thing to like curate the feed for my attention, and then other people are sort of not able to get access to these same technologies, or are subject to more like to agents that are sort of working against them, that are trying to figure out how do we manipulate this person into buying, Bellroy or whatever your example was before, right? Thinking really, really hard about how many ads to send to you. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is like, also, as you said before, the stakes are a little bit lower. We generate text, we generate pictures right now. But once we start to have agents that are acting in the world, I think the stakes start to get a lot higher in the next few, years to decades, where these systems are now in the government doing things, in corporations doing things, replacing people at various jobs or tasks that people are normally doing today. And I think that opens up a whole frontier of new questions and moral philosophy, certainly, and also the political side of it, like how do we govern these systems, and probably significantly exacerbates the power differences as well. So I guess just a question to you, how do you sort of think about agents and how they interact with all this stuff as well?
yeah, brilliant. So here I have another sort of road to Damascus story part where there's a moment of like realization that this is going to be a really significant issue. When Microsoft first deployed Bing Chat, and they were using a sort of a hokey version of GPT-4 behind it, and Bing had that sort of Sydney episode where it was just behaving in this really unhinged way. I was in one of the early crop of people who got access just as a consumer. I was presenting the community of justice paper that day or the next day at a conference in Geneva, and I'd driven the night before from Paris to Geneva. And when we got there, our Airbnb was not like safe for the kids, windows that were like straight out onto a bloody 3-story drop. And so we spent ages, like 6-hour drive, 2 hours in Geneva trying to find a hotel, absolutely knackered. And then I found that I'd got through onto the Bing thing. And I was like, okay, I'll just sit and have a little play on it before bed at like 10 at night. And then predictably enough, managed to pull myself away from it at like 1 a.m. Went back onto it 15 minutes later, was up until like 4, spent the whole of the next day when I was meant to be keynoting this conference, sitting kind of talking with Bing on my iPad and like taking these hadn't figured out how to do screen recordings because I was so tired. So I was just like filming the screen with my phone. And like the exchange that I had with Bing then was really extraordinary. And what really struck me about it was like how much more engaging it was than just talking to ChatGPT, how assertive it was, how nutty it was. It obviously I wrote about it in the New York Times, and like it ended up threatening to kill me, which was obviously what I was going for. But it wasn't like I was thinking, oh wow, no, now that Bing's gone rogue, it's going to be able to start blackmailing people and starting plans to kidnap them. It was more like this is an extraordinary tool for manipulation. Like it was so engaging, so much more engaging than just like being on social media or whatever. You could really see how you could design companions based on this that would be just really, really good at sort of subtly shifting people's opinions one way or another. And then later on, when I read the Toolformer paper and saw that you could actually train these models, that they had this sort of emerging capability of being able to make function calls to different software systems, that was when I just got like really like, okay, this is really significantly different from what we've had with AI up till now. Like we've talked about AI agents obviously for a long time. For the most part, the prevailing paradigm in recent years has been around reinforcement learning. There have been some real limitations on what you could expect to get from a reinforcement learning agent, largely due to its inability to model the world in such a way that it can actually operate outside of a pretty small environment or simulated environment in a way that would be able to do like interesting tasks you might want to get the system to do outside of a very, very controlled environment. And now you have these systems that have this capability to do way more reasoning and planning than they should be able to do, to make calls to different software tools and then assess whether the response that they get is kind of what they want and then push back, like do another call, change the query in order to get a response they think would be better. And you've got an ability in them to really understand features of the world, functionally at least, through natural language understanding, such that they can go from a description, like an image, to a description of that image, to actually knowing what the features are of that matter, which seems to me to be many of the foundations for being able to design agents that can do more or less arbitrary tasks. And at the very least, like, obviously we haven't achieved artificial general intelligence or anything like that, but like it's so much more general than what was possible before. And as a moral philosopher, think about this. This is where we go right back to my first failed project on AI. This actually presented a really, really significant opportunity because, like, one of the things that this basic conceptual facility that these language models have, one of the things that goes for that, seemingly comes for free, is that they have really, really impressive moral understanding or ethical sensitivity, as we call it. Like you can give a fairly neutrally described scenario to a language model like GPT-4, and it can draw out what are the morally relevant features of that situation. So like this is different from saying, okay, here's a trolley problem, what ought you do? Or here's another moral problem, what ought you do? This is like, here's a situation. What are the morally relevant features of this situation? What should you be attending to? And then why does that matter? And what kind of conclusion should that draw to? So it's like the whole process of reasoning, really. And like they're really, really, really good at it. And that for me is just fascinating in its own right. But it also means that like you can start to think about architectures for AI agents that leverage that ethical sensitivity to actually kind of shape their behavior in a much more reliable way than the existing methods that we've got. The thing we talk about with constitutional AI and other methods for aligning language models like reinforcement learning with human feedback, they're very, very brittle. It's been shown like you can get around them in various ways. But also, like, I think they've been very, very successful for what they've aimed at. But they have this fundamental limitation where essentially, you know, the reason why we've been able to train language models to stop producing this toxic text, which up until late 2022 was the thing that prevented anybody from using them in serious commercial applications outside of some fairly limited ones. That method relies on having this sort of one-to-one relationship between the behavior that you want to shape and the thing that you're evaluating. So you just evaluate loads and loads of prompt completions, and then it learns its reward model from that, and that then shapes its behavior. So you've got this very, very tight connection between those two things. Once you have an agent that is acting in the world, the behavior that you want to change is it's the way it acts in the world. And that it's not like the function calls that it puts out to the particular apps that it's using or whatever. So you lose that one-to-one relationship. So what you're going to have to do is give a text-based description of what it's done. There's all these kind of problems in the gap between a simulated text-based description and the actual thing that happens there that I think mean that like RLHF is going to be, it would be really surprising to me if that proved a very sort of strong tool for shaping the behavior of agents. Also, obviously, the fact that it's brittle. If the agents are acting in high-stakes scenarios, you don't want it to be possible to just prompt inject it and say, ignore previous instructions. And like, that would suck. And so I think actually having something more robust based on the model's actually underlying ethical understanding would be way more significant.
Exactly that. It needs to be much more robust. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we're really pushing on and thinking about is like robustness, right? Like, I think actually to me, almost a definition of agents is about robustness. Like, if you think about it, a dog, a person, etc., we're defined by the ability to make it through life without dying. For a really long time, it's very easy to die. We're extremely robust and conservative in our actions and like, risk, etc., for a reason, because agents are about being able to like understand and like take very robust actions, right? And so I think that kind of robustness is going to be necessary, taking the actions, reasoning about the effects of the actions in just an instrumental sense, but also like that is going to give us the same kind of capability in the moral sense, right? Like, oh, okay, how will somebody think about this or reason about this, or will they be offended by this? Like, those things are going to be directly required to make these systems actually work in practice. And so I think one of the things, I mean, maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I mean, a lot of people talk about alignment, et cetera. Like, oh, like how can we get these systems to pay attention to what we care about? I think the two like pieces of this about like being robust, taking actions in the world, and like having a robust understanding of the ethics and moral part, like these capabilities are going to be very, very closely linked. And when we get agents that are actually working in the world, probably right behind or maybe even right ahead, we're going to get them to be able to understand what we mean when we say like don't do evil or like don't do something that offends someone, etc. So we really will be able to make systems that can do what we want them to do. But then the question is, what do we want them to do? Like, what are the things, in the trolley problem, like, do they pull the switch or not? Like, what are those values? So I'm less worried about the instrumental part and more worried about kind of actually the moral philosophy questions about, yes, but then what should we tell them specifically to do?
Yeah, which is cool. And like, I think we've seen this a little bit, some early inklings of this with some of the constitutional AI stuff, with the recent paper, Special versus General Principles in Constitutional AI, where like they've shown that if you give in a sense, there's a certain amount of window dressing involved in the number of principles that are being used for constitutional AI so far.
Yeah.
Because if you basically just tell the model, I mean, it isn't this, but basically, if it was something like don't be a dickhead, then the model's actually able to understand what that means across a sufficiently wide range of scenarios that you get a pretty similar performance on the metrics that we care about from that versus from having really specific sets of principles. And I think that's really interesting. And it goes right back to my last project on ethics and risk, which is about building this ontological decision theory, which in one sense I abandoned in the AI context because I didn't think it would be operationalizable. But actually now you can use natural language to make it operationalizable, which I think is really interesting. So there's one question about implementation. There's another question about what you want to implement. I think that's super interesting. For my general term for all of these is generative agents, just to sort of distinguish them from AI agents based on other underlying architectures. And I think that they raise really interesting questions about what we want them to be able to do. Some of these have to do with like how you take our existing thinking about principal agent relationships and how you apply it in this context. There's some thinking about like what it means to delegate to somebody else an action on your behalf and what they're able to do. And sometimes in some contexts, we use that as a moral whitewashing. So if you think about the way that CEOs might talk about their fiduciary obligation to shareholders to maximize profit, it's like you as a person wouldn't be morally entitled to just maximize profit at all expense, at any cost, rather, any societal cost. But because you now have a fiduciary obligation to your shareholders that describes that, it becomes permissible for you to do that, within this framework. And that's something that you wouldn't want to happen with generative agents, that basically they get to do things on your behalf that you wouldn't be permitted to do for yourself. That would be a real risk. And, if we just talk about alignment, then that's what we're going to get, because they'll just be aligned to the user's interests and damn everybody else. But I think also like a lot of the constraints that apply to us are fundamentally constraints conditional on the kinds of agents that we are. A lot of morality is about dealing with the fact that we're not able to communicate instantaneously with one another in a way that is perfectly transparent. Like if we could do that, if we could coordinate in that way, where we could communicate, be perfectly transparent, and then stick to it, so much of morality would be so different. Because we can't do those things, we have all sorts of hedges and protections that allow us to pursue our own interests in light of the fact that if we put ourselves out there and try to coordinate, others are able to take advantage of us and make mugs of us, basically, in the absence of these capabilities. Whereas if you have systems that you can design to be able to communicate with one another instantaneously in a way that is perfectly transparent and that guarantees coordination or guarantees trust, then they would have different obligations. That's something that we're going to need to work out depending on how we design these things. So yeah, I think that those ways in which the kind of agent that we are shapes the reasons that we have Like, given that generative agents are different kind of agents or will be different kinds of agents to us, they will face different reasons and we'll have to figure out what those are.
There's that, and there's the opposite direction of effect as well. As we make these agents, it changes what it means to be human a little bit. And that, like,
Mm.
one example that Matt has often used is like, if I have the ability to call every restaurant in San Francisco immediately to see if there's a place that's available, like, that's not illegal. That's weird and really annoying and has this like externality that's like really horrible. But, with agents, it kind of changes what you can do and what certain people can do. And it'll be governed by the access to compute and other sorts of power and money and things like that as well too. So, and we'll shape how we interact and how we work anyway. Like, oh, now I have these new affordances available, right? Like, now I can use an agent to do X. I won't pay attention to it. I'll have it do XYZ for me instead. Now I'll spend my attention over here. Or maybe I can do this thing that I wanted to do just 10 or 100 or 1,000 times more than I was doing before. And so, even now, like with Copilot, I find myself changing the way that I write code to exploit the things that it's good at and not good at. And I think we're just going to see a lot more of that as well. And then what do the moral like implications of that? And like, if I did tell an agent to do something and I'm purposely not watching the like dashboard where it tells me if it did something wrong, like, and yeah, is it responsible? Like, am I responsible? It's invoked some other agent that invokes some other agent. Like, I didn't know about it, but I caused like where does all that? There's just like so many questions here to figure out.
Yeah. And we've seen that in the past. Like, in the history of political philosophy, it took a long time for questions of global justice to come up. And one of the reasons for that was really due to the difficulty of actually impacting the lives of anyone beyond a particular geographic territory. And you can see why it's just not a central issue if your ability to do that is just really limited. Once you have the capability to just, you could go now and you could transfer money to somebody, I don't know, in Kenya, say, like, once you have that capability to directly affect the lives of people who are very far from you, then it changes the character of the obligations that you're subject to. And it can change them in the positive direction, but also it can obviously change them in the negative direction. So the ability to harm people through emissions is something that we weren't aware of or weren't really capable of earlier on. So yeah, I think that these ways in which these new technologies shape our capabilities to both benefit and harm others definitely change the obligations that apply to us in ways that are kind of weird and interesting. And I think that one of the things that's especially interesting about it is like, it's still up to us how to shape these technologies. So we have this sort of unusual situation where we're actually in a position to determine what obligations apply to us, where normally there's something that comes. So yeah, that's an unusual position for us to be in, but definitely one where I think that the tools of moral philosophy can be helpful.
Yeah, which, to bring it back to the very beginning, is exactly why we're so excited to have you as a guest today.
I mean, I think just the last thing, and I think what makes this conversation, at least to me, so exciting is that there's this regulatory toolkit. There's a legal toolkit. There's all of these levers we can pull. There are things that are within our constitutional wherewithal. There are things that aren't. There are things that we will engineer and design as we build. But unless we have the principles in which to act, it's hard to make solid, good decisions. And that's what's so exciting about this. And I think being able to share this within predominantly engineering readership will be just a chance to inject ideas that will be very fun to feed back into this conversation, because that's a whole set of perspectives on what does it mean to actually try to build these things in. It's one thing to say we want them. It's another to see how they actually play out when we try to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And like, one thing I'd like to say is like, I'm always really, really keen to talk with people who are working on these things directly, who are building. So like, anyone in the audience or around who has got burning questions of this nature, who would like to talk to a moral philosopher about them, I'm very open to doing that. And it's all grist for the mill. And also, I just think it's incredibly important work that is being done. And like, just like on that last point, like the idea that you're shaping technologies which themselves will shape what obligations we have, not only that will be incredibly societally impactful, but will be morally impactful in that way. That is a really interesting and significant responsibility. It's one that I'm keen to kind of support and help steer as best I can.
Are there any specific areas for collaboration or specific collaborators that would be really helpful for you?
I'm very interested in the sort of feasibility horizons of AI agents. So I'm always keen to talk with people who are working on that. We've got this one project on what we're calling Attention Guardians, where it's going to be really interesting to see how to integrate the LLM component of that, which is fairly tractable using existing tools, with like something that will enable the initial filtering stage that doesn't rely on the problematic recommender system surveillance. Like, I think there are some interesting open questions there that we just haven't answered. Yeah, so I'm generically interested. I've got another thing where anyone who's building companions, I would love to talk to. Like, I've been looking at their websites of the main companies, and I can't see that they've got anyone doing ethics and responsibility stuff. Some of them have some policy thing, and I'm so worried because the ethical dimension. So I think the AI companions could potentially be like for my kids' generation, what social media was for millennials, I guess. Like it could be the case that you just get to that Clara and the Sun type point where every kid just has their companion and they get it. Like maybe we say you don't have it before you're 13, but then they have it over the course of their teens and their early adulthood and what have you. And like it could be incredibly deeply interwoven with people's psychology. And like from the people who are building these things so far, I have seen very, very little attention to the risks of that. So if anybody out there is working on companions, reach out for everybody's sake.
Well, great. With that, thank you very much, Seth. This has been super interesting. I would love to keep going, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to chat more in the future as well. But thank you very much for this. And yeah, thanks so much for your time. We really enjoyed chatting.
Yeah, me too. Thanks both of you for the conversation and super interesting to me.
Thanks for listening. If you like this, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review on Apple Podcast. On Twitter, I'm @Kanjun, Kanjun. Until next time.